Steven Seagal, not just one, but a series of action movies that once dominated the box office, for more than 3 decades standing at the center of Hollywood power, a man who redefined the image of a martial artist on screen, not through special effects, but through absolute control, a chilling coldness, and a will that never accepted defeat. From above the law to under siege, he did not just play the hero. He became the symbol of strength that needed no explanation, an embodiment of power that asked for no permission. Millions once saw him as the standard of invincibility, a man the world believed could not be broken. But behind that image was a story that was far from glorious and full of cracks, a childhood lacking emotional connection. A young man who left his homeland to escape the very silence within himself, only to face another form of loneliness in a foreign land. The years living as an outsider in Japan, where he had to prove his worth every day, every hour. Relationships that began with hope but ended in distance and abandonment. Broken marriages, children who grew up distant, and decisions that could not be undone. Then, when the Hollywood spotlight shone on him, it did not heal him. It magnified everything he carried with him. Fame came quickly, power came early, and with it came conflicts, criticisms, and an image increasingly distorted through the public eye. Accusations appeared, doors gradually closed, and the man who once stood at the peak began to disappear from the very place that had created him. And now, at the age of 73, when his body is slowing down and the world has moved on to another generation, the question is no longer how great he once was, but what really happened behind all those years. What turned a symbol into a controversial figure? What made a man who always controlled everything gradually lose control of his own life? And most importantly, have we ever truly understood the person behind the name Steven Seagal? Or were we only seeing the version the world had created for him? A version defined by judgment, by distance, and by stories that were never fully told. Before we dive deeper into the story behind the real Steven Seagal, please hit like and subscribe to the channel as a way of respect for a life that has never been fully told. It would be easier if everything started with light, with a childhood full of laughter and hugs long enough for a child to feel like he belonged somewhere. But for Steven Seagal, everything started with silence. He was born in Lansing, in a family that was not lacking material things to the point of desperation, but lacked something more important: connection. The house where he grew up was not a place of long conversations, not a place where emotions were listened to and understood. It was a place of discipline, of rules that needed no explanation, of distances that no one tried to fill. His father was a strict man who believed in strength, who believed that emotions were something to be controlled, not expressed. He was not a cruel father, but he was not an approachable father either. Rare praises, almost non-existent hugs. Love, if it existed, existed in the form of responsibility, not tenderness. And, for a child, sometimes the lack of tenderness hurts even more than harshness. In such an environment, Steven did not learn how to share. He learned how to stay silent. He learned how to observe, how to read the atmosphere in the room, how to understand the things that were not said. But he did not learn how to talk about himself. When other children turned to their parents for comfort, he learned to keep everything inside. When fear appeared, he had no one to name it with him. When hurt happened, there was no one to sit down and say that everything would be okay. And over time, that not only created distance between him and his family, it created distance between him and his own emotions. There is a very special kind of loneliness. Not when there is no one around, but when there are people there, but you cannot reach them. That is the kind of loneliness Steven grew up with. Meals happened in silence more than laughter. Days passed without real conversations. A house that had everything needed to survive, but not enough to feel loved. And when a child does not feel love, he begins to create his own ways to protect himself from that feeling of absence. Stephen began to build a shell, not immediately, not consciously, but little by little. He learned not to depend on others. He learned not to expect too much, because expectation always comes with disappointment. He learned to control himself, to control his reactions, to control his surroundings. Because when you cannot control whether others love you or not, you find ways to control everything else. And over time, that control was no longer a choice, it became instinct. But the price of self-defense is always isolation. When you build walls high enough that no one can hurt you, you also unintentionally prevent anyone from getting close to you. Stephen grew up not as a child nurtured by connection, but as someone who always stood outside, observing the world from a safe distance. He could be in the middle of a room full of people, but still feel like he did not really belong there. And that feeling, once formed so early, rarely disappears. It only changes shape. When entering his teenage years, those distances did not narrow. They became clearer. People around him began to form deeper relationships, began to understand how to trust, how to open up, how to rely on others. But for Stephen, those things did not come naturally. He did not know how to do that because he had never been taught. And when you do not know how to connect, you are easily misunderstood as distant. When you do not know how to express emotions, you are easily seen as cold. But that coldness was not his original nature. It was something built to hide a void that no one had ever helped him fill. Perhaps that is what few people see when they look at the man he became later. They see a man who is controlling, tough, hard to approach. They see a man who seems to need no one, but very few people stop to wonder where that feeling of needing no one comes from. It is not strength. It is an adaptation. A child learns to live without being loved, then grows up into a man who does not know what to do with love when it appears. And in the long silence from that childhood, one thing was formed very early, a belief that if you want to survive, you must control everything yourself. Because if you let others get too close, they might leave. And if they leave, you will have to face the very feeling you have tried to avoid your whole life. There are people who leave because of ambition. But there are also people who leave because they cannot stand the silence behind their backs for one more day. For Steven Seagal, the decision to leave the United States did not begin with a clear dream. It began with a feeling that if he stayed, he would continue to be trapped in the very person he could not understand. And so he left. Not because he knew what he was looking for, but because he knew he had to get away from the place that had taught him how to be silent. He arrived in Japan, a foreign land where everything from the language, the culture, to the way people existed was completely different. There, no one knew who he was. No one cared what he had been through. And in a brief moment, that gave him a sense of freedom, a chance to start over, to become a different version of himself. But the freedom did not last. Very quickly after that, the truth revealed itself in a cold and unavoidable way. In a place where you do not belong, every day is not an opportunity but a challenge. Stephen was not just a foreigner. He was an outsider in a system that was not created to welcome people like him. The eyes that followed him on the street did not carry curiosity, but carried caution. The silences in conversations were not out of respect, but because of a distance that could not be filled. He not only had to learn how to live in a different culture, he had to learn how to survive in an environment where every mistake was magnified, and mistakes were inevitable when you did not fully understand the world around you. Aikido became the only thing he could hold on to, not because it was easy, but because it had structure. In a world where he did not understand the language, did not understand the people, did not understand how to communicate, at least in the dojo, everything had rules. Every movement had meaning. Every mistake could be corrected. But even there, he still did not truly belong. The people around him had grown up in that tradition. They did not need to prove that they deserved to be there, but he had to do it every day. Every training session was not just physical practice. It was a silent battle to be accepted, a battle with no audience, no words of recognition, only fatigue that accumulated over time. The pressure began to seep into every smallest moment. There were no real days off. There was no place where he could let down the defenses he had built since childhood. Even when he stood still, his mind was still working, still alert, still preparing for the next possibility of rejection. And gradually, that tension became the normal state. A day without pressure became unfamiliar. A moment of peace made him feel uneasy, as if it was only the calm before something even harder happened. There was a paradox that he began to realize but could not put into words. He had left to escape isolation, but here he felt more isolated than ever. In America, he did not know how to connect. In Japan, he did not even have the chance to try. He stood between two worlds, but did not truly belong to either one. And when a person has no sense of belonging, they begin to create a version of themselves that they can control. A version that does not need acceptance. A version that does not need closeness. But the price of that was not small. When you try to become someone who needs no one, you also gradually forget the feeling of being needed by someone. The days passed and discipline and solitude did not heal the wounds from childhood. They only made them sink deeper. Stephen was no longer the child who had not been taught how to love. He became a man who did not believe that love was something that could last. And that belief, once formed, was not easy to break. In the rare moments when he stopped, when his body was so tired that he could not continue, there may have been a question that flashed through his mind. It was not, "Will I succeed?" but "Will I ever feel like I belong somewhere?" But that question had no clear answer. And when a question has no answer, people often do the only thing they know: keep moving forward, faster, stronger, deeper into the very path that had led them astray from the beginning. The deeper he went into life in Japan, Steven Seagal increasingly realized that if he could not belong to this place through language or culture, then he would have to belong to it to something else: endurance. And so Aikido was no longer just a path of learning. It became the only place where he could prove that he deserved to exist. Training sessions began from early morning and lasted until the body no longer had the strength to stand firm. Repeated falls to the point that the back and shoulders no longer felt pain in the usual way. Pain did not disappear. It only changed position, becoming a background part of life, like breathing, like a heartbeat. There were days when his body clearly resisted, pains that lasted through the night, bruises that had no time to heal, replaced by new injuries. But stopping was not an option, because in the world he was living in, stopping meant being left behind, and being left behind was something he had been familiar with long before. Discipline gradually lost its original meaning. It was no longer a path to becoming better. It became a way to survive. Every movement had to be precise. Every reflex had to be faster than others. Every mistake carried consequences, not only physically but also for his position in that environment. And when a person lives too long in a state of having to be perfect, they begin to no longer distinguish between developing and self-destructing. Stephen was not just training his body, he was pushing it to limits it had never been designed to endure. But in his mind, it was not exceeding limits. It was necessary. There were rare moments when he stood alone after training, sweat still dripping, his body trembling slightly from exhaustion. And in that silence, he may have felt something close to emptiness, not because he had not done enough, but because no matter how much he did, the feeling of absence inside remained unchanged. But instead of stopping to understand that feeling, he did the only thing he knew: continue. Faster, stronger, harsher with himself. His life gradually narrowed into a loop with no way out. Train, endure, control, repeat. Everything outside the dojo began to fade. Conversations no longer had meaning. Relationships were no longer nurtured. The outside world existed, but did not truly touch him, and in that void, he built a system of control that became tighter and tighter, not just controlling the body, but also controlling the environment, controlling the rhythm of life, controlling the way everything happened around him. Because when everything was controlled, at least he could temporarily forget the feeling that inside him there was still something not right. It was during that period that the marriage with Miyako Fujitani began to change in a way that no one could see immediately. At first, it was a rare connection, a support in a strange world, but as Steven's life increasingly revolved around discipline and control, the distance between the two of them also gradually widened. Not because of big arguments, but because the small things were no longer shared. The silences lasted longer. The evenings no longer had real conversations. When a person lives completely in their own world, there is no longer room for others to step in. Miyako may have tried to understand. She may have tried to stay, but there are distances that cannot be filled by effort from one side. As Steven became more and more closed off, more and more focused on perfecting himself according to a standard that could never be reached, that relationship gradually lost its original foundation. Family, which should have brought balance, could not compete with a man who was fighting with himself every day. There is a painful truth that few people realize. When a person does not learn how to be loved from a young age, they also do not know how to hold on to love when it arrives. Not because they do not want to, but because they do not understand how it works. Steven did not leave his family in a single moment. He left little by little. Through every day that he chose discipline instead of connection, control instead of sharing, endurance instead of opening up, and at some point, the distance had become too great to go back. While on the outside, he became stronger, more precise, more impressive. On the inside, a part of him gradually became depleted, but that was not something others could see. They saw a martial artist, a man who controlled every movement perfectly, a man who never showed weakness. But they did not see the price of that control. They did not see what he had to trade in order to become the person they admired. And in a world where strength is praised, no one really asked where that strength came from. No one asked whether it was built on a foundation of balance or on the foundation of a war that never ended inside the man himself. Then, at one point, even the walls of discipline that Steven Seagal had built around himself were no longer enough to keep everything in place. Life in Japan, which had once been the battlefield where he proved his worth, gradually became a different space. Not a place where he fought to be accepted, but a place where he began to feel trapped. Not because he had failed, but because he had achieved so much in a way that did not give him a sense of belonging. And when a person has become used to leaving as a way to survive, then even the good things are not enough to keep them there. The decision to leave Japan did not happen like an explosive moment. There was no big argument, no specific event that marked the end. It came like many other important decisions in his life quietly, drawn out and almost impossible to explain fully. One day, he was still there. And then, not long after, he was no longer there. Those around him may have noticed the change before he officially left. Longer silences in conversations, distance in his eyes, a feeling that he had already begun to leave from the inside before his body actually stepped away from that place. The family he built with Miyako Fujitani, which had once given him a rare form of stability, did not disappear immediately, but it began to crack from the moment he was no longer present in the way a husband, a father needed to be. It was not that he did not care, but he did not know how to exist in a relationship without needing control. Family required softness, sharing, the willingness to accept things that could not be measured or controlled, and those were things he had never truly learned. His departure did not come with a full explanation, because perhaps even he could not explain it. How do you tell the people you love that you have to leave? Not because they are not enough, But because you do not know how to stay, how do you express a nameless feeling, an urge with no clear origin, that if you do not keep moving, you will be trapped in your own life? And because there was no clear answer, he chose the only thing he knew: leaving. But every departure leaves something behind. Not just people, not just memories, but relationships that never had time to be completed, emotions that never had time to be understood, questions that never had the chance to be answered. And over time, those things left behind do not disappear. They accumulate. They become a part of him, whether he looks back or not. The decision to put his personal path above stability was not an easy choice, but for Steven, it gradually became a repeating pattern. When things became too close, too complicated, too hard to control, he left. Not because he did not care, but because he did not know how to exist in things he could not control. And each time like that, he started over again, in a different place with a different version of himself, but carrying the old cracks that had never been healed. There is a truth that not everyone is ready to face. Not every departure is liberation. Sometimes it is only the postponement of something you are not yet ready to confront. Steven left Japan, but he did not leave what he had become there. Discipline, control, closed-off nature, all of it followed him. And when he stepped into the next chapter of his life, those things did not disappear. They only found a new environment to exist in. Starting over in the United States, he was not a man with empty hands. He brought skills, a reputation in a small community, and a confidence built through years of endurance. But beneath all of that was an unstable foundation. A person who had become used to moving, used to not attaching too deeply, used to keeping distance even when standing next to those closest to him. And that, over time, not only affected his personal relationships, it began to affect the way he existed in the world. The cracks were not always visible right away. Sometimes they lay beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to show. And when Steven stepped into a new world, where the lights were brighter, where the pressure was greater, where everything was magnified, those cracks could no longer hide for long. But at the time he left Japan, all he knew was that he had to keep going, not turning back, not stopping, not looking too long at what he had left behind, because if he stopped, he might have to face a question he had never truly been ready to answer: that how much of what he had lost was something that could never be taken back. But there was one thing that even Steven Seagal himself had not realized at that time. Starting over did not mean starting from zero. He carried everything that had shaped him: discipline, control, closed-off nature, and also the empty spaces that had never been filled. And when he stepped into Hollywood, a world where everything was magnified, those things did not disappear. They only became clearer. Hollywood was not a place that waited for people like him. It was a system built on image, on stories, on the ability to make audiences believe in something that was not entirely real. But Steven brought something different: real combat martial arts. Not punches staged for visual appeal, but movements that carried real weight. Techniques forged through years in an unforgiving environment. That made him different from the start, and in an industry always looking for something fresh, that difference quickly became an opportunity. Above the Law was not just a movie. It was a door. When the cameras started rolling, when the lights shone on him, there was a transformation that even those around him could feel. The man who had once stood on the sidelines in a foreign country now stood at the center of a frame that millions of people would look at. And what was remarkable was not that he tried to become someone else. He did not need to. He simply brought his true self to the screen: the silence, the control, the coldness he had built over many years, and the audience believed it. Success came faster than he could have predicted. The next roles followed one after another: Hard to Kill, Marked for Death, and then Under Siege. Each film reinforced the image that the public began to associate with him: a man who was not easily shaken, A man who did not need to say much, but always controlled the situation. A man for whom violence was not an explosion, but precise calculation. In a short time, Steven Seagal was not just an action actor. He became a symbol of a different kind of strength. Quiet, not flashy, but impossible to dismiss. But there was a truth that the lights never reached. When you build your image based on what you truly are, there is no clear boundary between the person on screen and the person in real life. And for Steven, that began to create unavoidable collisions. While audiences saw a man who controlled everything, in the work environment that control began to become a problem. The film set was not a dojo. It was a place of collaboration, of different opinions, of decisions made not by one person alone. But Steven was used to a world where he had to control everything himself in order to survive. And when he brought that way into an environment that required flexibility, conflicts began to appear. Not immediately, not clearly from the start, but gradually, through each project, through each exchange. The differences in the way he saw the world and the way this industry operated became clearer. He did not give in easily. He did not easily accept that there were things outside his control. And for those around him, that could be understood as stubbornness, as being difficult to work with, as lacking flexibility. But from his perspective, it was simply the way he had always lived, control or be controlled. And for him, the second option had never been a real choice. Success, in a way, did not change him. It only placed him in a position where all his traits were magnified. What had once helped him survive in the past, discipline, focus, the ability to endure, now helped him stand out. But what had once been defense mechanisms, the closed-off nature, the need for control, the difficulty in trusting also, began to become clearer than ever. And in an environment where everything was observed, evaluated, and retold, nothing could really stay hidden forever. There were people who could adapt to Hollywood by changing themselves. There were people who learned to be softer, more flexible, more approachable. But Steven was not one of them. He did not step into Hollywood to become a different version of himself. He stepped in with everything he already was. And for a while, that helped him succeed. But over time, that very thing also began to create distances that not everyone could overcome. And like everything else in his life, those distances did not appear suddenly. They formed gradually, through every small moment, through every misunderstanding, through every decision where no one truly agreed. And when looking back, he might realize that Hollywood was not the place that had changed him. It was only the place that had allowed the whole world to see more clearly the person he had always been. And then, something few people realize began to happen quietly but irreversibly. Success did not only lift Steven Seagal to the peak, it began to reshape the way he saw the world, and the way the world saw him back. The movies followed one after another, the roles where he not only acted but almost controlled the entire rhythm, put him in a position that very few people achieved in such a short time. His name no longer just appeared on posters. It became a guarantee for a very specific kind of strength, cold, precise, emotionless, and always victorious. Fame came so fast that there was almost no space to think. Meetings, contracts, offers. A world that once did not know who he was now turned toward him with non-stop attention. And for a while, that could bring a feeling he had never had before, the feeling of being seen. Not as an outsider, not as someone who had to prove his worth, but as the center of attention. But that feeling did not come alone. It brought along something else, something harder to recognize, a change in the way he understood himself. When a person is constantly told that they are special, that they are different, that they are the center of what is happening, the boundary between truth and image begins to blur. For Steven, that did not happen in one day. It accumulated through each role, each praise, each moment when power was in his hands. Gradually, the ego was no longer just a part of him. It became a system he lived inside. A system where he always had to be right, always had to control, always had to hold firm the position he had achieved. But the price of that was not shown on screen. It appeared in the silences between takes, in conversations where he no longer truly listened, in relationships he no longer knew how to maintain. When you get used to everything revolving around you, recognizing others as independent individuals becomes harder, not because you do not want to, but because you are no longer placed in situations that force you to do so. The connection to reality began to fade in a way that even he did not realize. The people around him changed. Not everyone stayed because of who he really was. Some stayed because of the position he held. Some stayed because of what they could get. And in such an environment, distinguishing who was real and who was fake became almost impossible. But instead of stopping to ask questions, he continued moving forward, because moving forward was the only thing he knew how to do. There is a paradox that very few people at the top dare to face. The more people see you, the easier it is to become invisible to yourself. Steven became an image, a character that the public recognized instantly. But inside, the distance between the man he was and that image grew larger and larger. He was no longer just the man who had left Japan, the man who had endured to prove his worth. He became a symbol. And a symbol, by definition, is not allowed to be weak. But a human being is, and when a human being no longer has space to be weak, they find ways to hide it. For Steven, that hiding did not come by withdrawing. It came by controlling more, working more, demanding more, keeping everything within the range he could manage. But the more he tried to control, the more he had to face the truth that not everything could be controlled. And each time reality did not go the way he wanted, the distance between him and the world around him widened a little more. The isolation did not begin when he failed. It began right when he was at the peak, when everything seemed most perfect, when his name was everywhere, when no one doubted his position. That was also the time he began to stand alone more than ever. Not because there was no one around, but because there was no longer anyone truly with him in the way he needed. And over time, two people began to exist in parallel, one on-screen certain, in control, unshakable, and one inside silent, tense, and increasingly distant from what had once made him who he was. Those two versions did not conflict directly. They simply drifted apart, little by little, until the distance between them became too great to close. People looking from the outside saw a legend, a man who achieved what they dreamed of, but very few saw what was happening inside a slow but irreversible shift, where success was no longer the destination, but became a force pulling him farther away from the very person he had once tried to protect. And in that silence, no one really asked whether the price of standing at the peak was gradually losing the ability to come back or not. And then, the inevitable began to happen. Not like a loud collapse, but like a slow shift that only those very close could feel. Steven Seagal still stood there, still the name that once guaranteed success, but the atmosphere around him began to change. On the film set, which had once been a space where he could control everything the way he wanted, the first cracks appeared more clearly. Exchanges were no longer simple. Decisions were no longer accepted naturally. Looks began to carry hesitation instead of trust. The conflict did not come from one side. It came from the difference in the way the world was perceived. For Steven, control was the way to ensure everything happened exactly as desired. But for others, especially directors and actors, filmmaking was a collaborative process where each person needed space to contribute. When these two approaches collided, neither side was truly wrong, but neither side was willing to step back. And over time, the small collisions began to accumulate. Not big confrontations right away, but repeated disagreements. Moments where no one said everything they thought, but everyone felt that something was no longer right. Reputation is not built only from what you do right. It is also shaped by the way you work with others. And when stories about difficulties in collaboration began to spread, they did not need official confirmation to become truth in the eyes of the industry. A comment backstage, a shared experience among those who had worked together, a bad impression repeated enough times. All of that combined to create an image that was not easy to change. Steven may not have realized immediately the extent of the impact of these things, because from his position, everything was still happening. Movies were still being made, contracts were still being signed, but there were changes that could not be seen with the naked eye. Calls no longer came as frequently as before. Opportunities began to shift toward other names. People who had once been willing to collaborate began to hesitate, not because of one specific event, but because of a feeling that had accumulated over time. Professional relationships, like all relationships, need to be maintained. But when a person increasingly withdraws into their own system of control, maintaining that becomes more difficult. Conversations no longer carry exchange, but become one-sided decisions. Differing opinions are no longer seen as opportunities for improvement, but become elements that need to be eliminated. And in an environment where creativity depends on the diversity of perspectives, that gradually creates distances that cannot be narrowed. No one is removed from Hollywood in a single day. It is a process, a shift from the center to the edge, step by step. Steven was not pushed out immediately. He was still there, but no longer in the position he once held. Projects changed, scale changed, interest changed, and over time, those changes accumulated into a reality that no one could deny. He was no longer the center of this industry anymore. What made that process hard to recognize was that it did not come with a clear moment to mark it. There was no specific day when everything ended. There was no official statement that everything had changed. There was only a feeling, at first very vague, that things were no longer as before. And then that feeling became clearer, until it was no longer a feeling, but the truth. From the outside, this could be seen as the consequence of personal choices, but from the inside, it was much more complicated. Because Steven was not someone who intentionally broke the relationships around him. He was simply living the way he had always lived. Controlling, keeping distance, not depending. And for a long time, that way had helped him move forward. But in a different environment, where connection was no less important than talent, that same approach began to create consequences that he could not easily reverse. There is a special kind of silence when a person begins to leave the center they once belonged to. It is not the silence of nothing happening. It is the silence of everything happening without anyone saying it out loud. People who were once around began to appear less. Conversations became shorter. Doors did not close in an obvious way. They simply no longer opened. And in that silence, Steven stood in a position he had never been used to. Not someone completely rejected, but also no longer someone welcomed as before. A space in between, where the past was still there, but the future was no longer clear. And it was precisely in that space that one thing began to become clearer than ever: that success could take you very high. But the way you exist in that success is what determines how long you can stay there. But there was one place where, in a brief moment, Steven Seagal once believed he could stop, could breathe, could not need to control everything that was family. When he met Kelly LeBrock, everything seemed to carry a different color. Not the lights, not the pressure, not the hidden battles on the film set, but a space that seemed simpler, where a man could become a husband, a father, instead of a symbol that always had to maintain his image. In the early years, that relationship carried something he had never truly had before: a feeling of stability. Family, in theory, could be the place that holds a person when everything else begins to move too fast. It could be the anchor point, the thing that helps balance what happens outside and what exists inside. And for a while, that seemed true. The children who appeared in his life were not just responsibilities. They were opportunities for him to experience something he had never been taught how to do: bonding, ordinary moments, meals, evenings without cameras or lights brought a kind of quiet he did not find anywhere else. But quiet is not always the same as peace. For a person used to living in tension, in control, in always having to keep everything in hand, quiet sometimes becomes something uncomfortable. It has no clear structure. It has no specific rules, and most importantly, it cannot be controlled in the way he was used to. Family requires flexibility, compromise, the willingness to put others before oneself in important moments. And those were things that Stephen, even if he tried, still did not really know how to maintain long term. The cracks did not appear immediately. They started from small things, absences that lasted longer than expected, conversations that were cut short, decisions made without the participation of the other person. And over time, those small things accumulated into a larger distance. Kelly may have seen the change before it became clear to outsiders, a man who became increasingly hard to approach, increasingly closed off, and increasingly carried a need for control, not only in work, but also in personal life. Infidelity was not the only cause, but it was a clear breaking point. It was not only an emotional betrayal, but also the manifestation of a pattern that had existed before. When things became too close, too complicated, he found a way to escape instead of staying and facing it. And each time like that, the distance between him and his family widened a little more. Not because there was no longer affection, but because there was no longer the ability to maintain it in the way of family needs. Control, which had once helped him survive and succeed, began to take a different form in personal life. It was no longer a tool to keep everything stable. It became a pressure, a presence that made those around him feel limited instead of supported. And when a relationship no longer has space to breathe, it gradually loses its ability to exist. Conflicts did not explode in a single moment. They dragged on. They repeated. They became a part of daily life, to the point that both sides began to feel exhausted, not because they did not want to continue, but because they did not know how to continue. And when a relationship reaches the point where the question is no longer how to fix it, but what is left to hold on to, then the end is almost inevitable. Divorce is not a single event. It is the result of many years of accumulated, unresolved things, and when it happened, it did not only end a marriage, it left empty spaces, questions, feelings with no clear answers. For Stephen, it was not just losing a spouse, it was confirmation that once again he had not been able to hold on to something he once believed could hold him in place. For Kelly, it was not just the end of a relationship. It was the shattering of an image she had once trusted that. Behind that strong man was a person who could share, who could bond, who could stay. And when that image no longer existed, what remained was reality, with everything it carried. Family, which had once been expected to be a place of salvation, could no longer hold that role, not because it was not strong enough, but because the person inside it could not maintain the connection necessary for it to exist. And when a person loses the place they can return to, they often do the familiar thing: continue moving forward, as if movement could replace facing things. But there are things that cannot be left behind just by leaving. Broken relationships do not disappear. They become a part of the story that you carry with you. And for Stephen, that was a part he could not control in the way he was used to. A part that no technique, no discipline could fully repair. And in the silence after everything ended, perhaps for the first time, he had to face a truth he had avoided for a very long time. That not everything in life can be held on to, no matter how strong you are. But there is one thing that very few people realize when looking at a collapse. It rarely happens in a single moment. For Steven Seagal, the change did not come like a sudden fall, but like a slow current, quietly pulling him away from the position he once stood in. After the years at the peak, where his name was tied to successful action movies, everything began to change in a way that at first almost no one noticed. Projects still continued, cameras still rolled, but something had become different. The roles no longer carried the same weight as before. Scripts were no longer built around him the way they once were. Movies that were once events now became products that passed by without leaving a lasting mark, not because he no longer had the ability, but because the world around him had changed. Audiences changed. The market changed. And most importantly, the way they looked at him also changed. The image of the hero he once represented no longer carried the same convincing power. At one time, his silence on screen was a sign of strength. Now it began to be perceived as repetition. Movements that once amazed audiences now became familiar, and in an industry always looking for something new, familiarity was no longer an advantage. It became a limitation. The public did not turn their backs immediately. They started with doubt. Then came comparison, and finally, in some cases, mockery. What was once celebrated was now placed under a different light. Not everything changed all at once, but it was enough to create a feeling that his position was no longer as solid as before. Hollywood, in its own way, never announces when someone is no longer at the center. It simply keeps moving, leaving behind those who cannot keep up with the new rhythm. Steven was not removed publicly. He still worked, still appeared, but no longer in the place where all eyes were directed. Big projects gradually became fewer. Opportunities shifted to new faces, and in a world where presence depends on the level of attention, no longer being mentioned much became a form of disappearing. What made this process hard to accept was not the change in the industry, but the lack of a clear moment to understand that everything had changed. There was no single day when he woke up and realized he had left the peak. There were only small signs repeating over time. A call that did not come, a role that no longer fit, a project that was not continued. And gradually, those signs combined into a reality that could not be denied. From the outside, this could be seen as a natural rule. Every star has its time, every career has its cycle. But from the inside, it was not that simple. Because for a person who had built himself based on control, not being able to control the direction of his own career was a hard experience to accept, not because he did not understand that everything changes, but because he was not used to not being able to influence that change. The collapse did not come with loud noise. It came in silence, a silence different from the silence of childhood. This was the silence of no longer being mentioned in the way you were once used to, a silence where no one actively said that you had passed your time, but everything around showed it. And in that silence, a question began to appear. Not immediately, but clearly enough that it could not be ignored. Not, why did this happen, but what did I miss? But that question was not easy to answer, because it was not only related to what happened outside, but also to what had formed inside from a very long time ago. The choices, the ways of reacting, the relationships that had not been maintained, all of them contributed to creating the path that led to this moment. But when you are in the flow of it, looking back with clarity is not easy, and instead of stopping to analyze, people often do the familiar thing: keep moving, keep working, keep holding on to what is left. Steven did not disappear. He simply was no longer in the position he once stood in. And in a world where that position defined so many things, that change carried a weight that not everyone could see. A shift from the center to the edge, not because of a single failure, but because of many factors accumulated over time. There are people who leave the peak with a clear decision. There are people who are pushed out by a specific event. But for Steven, it was a prolonged process where each step was not big enough to draw attention, but enough to take him a little farther from where he once belonged. And when looking back, he might realize that the hardest thing was not losing that position, but accepting that it had not been there for a very long time before he actually realized it. And then, When everything had begun to slow down, when the lights no longer shone directly on him as before, something else appeared. Not loud at first, but strong enough to completely change the way the world looked at Steven Seagal. Accusations began to be mentioned, at first scattered, then denser, appearing in interviews, in stories being told, in words that before might have been overlooked. Not all came at once, but they came enough to form a wave that could not be ignored. The media quickly seized those stories. In a world where information spreads faster than ever, each accusation did not stop at the person telling it. It was repeated, analyzed, placed in bigger headlines, wider contexts, and when many stories appeared at the same time, they began to create an overall image. An image no longer like the man the public once saw on screen. Reputation, which had taken many years to build, began to change in a way that left no chance for gradual adjustment. It was no longer the slow shift as before. This time the change happened faster, more clearly. What was once seen as strength was now looked at through a different lens. The traits that once made him stand out now became things being questioned. And in an environment where public image can be shaped just by a few stories repeated enough times, controlling the way one is perceived became almost impossible. Stephen was not the only one who had ever faced accusations, but the way each person reacts to them creates the difference. In his case, the reaction did not come in the way the public usually expects. There were no long explanations, no interviews to respond to each detail, no clear effort to change the story being told. The silence, which had once been part of the image he built, now carried a different meaning. No longer control, but a void that others could fill with their own speculations. And when a story is not told by the person involved, it will be told by others, with different perspectives, with details chosen in a way that suits the storyteller. Over time, that silence was no longer neutral. It became part of how the story was understood, not because it confirmed anything, but because it did not deny clearly enough to create a different direction. His public image, which had already changed before, now almost completely collapsed in the eyes of a large part of the audience. It was no longer a debate about working style or the way he appeared on screen. This time, it touched a deeper layer, the way he was perceived as a human being. And when the image at that level is affected, restoring it is not just a matter of time. It is a matter of trust. Those who had worked with him might keep their own experiences. Those who had once admired him might begin to question. And those who had never known much about him now knew him through a completely different lens. A lens not built through movies, but through personal stories brought into the public. The isolation, which had already existed before, now became clearer than ever. Not only isolation in personal relationships, but isolation in the way he existed among the public. When negative stories took up most of the space, what was different became harder to see, not because it did not exist, but because it was no longer what people focused on. There are people who, when facing such pressure, choose to step out, confront it directly, and try to change the story. There are people who choose to withdraw completely. Steven seemed to stand in a different position, not completely stepping out, but also not completely disappearing. He still existed, still continued on his path, but not in a way that the public could easily follow or understand clearly. And in that void, where there was no clear story being told from his side, what remained was what others had said, had written, had repeated. Not all of it was complete, not all of it reflected the whole person he was, but in the eyes of the public, that was what was available. And in a world where perception is often built from what is most accessible, that was enough to shape the way a person is remembered. There was no single moment when everything changed, but when looking back, it could be seen clearly that this was a turning point. Not the starting point of the change, but the point where the change became irreversible, a point from which onward, returning to the previous image, was no longer something that could be achieved just by time or effort. And in the prolonged silence that followed, one thing became clearer than ever. that there are stories once told in a certain way that will continue to exist in that way, no matter what the person involved says or does not say. And then, after everything that had happened, what remained was not a battle to return, but a departure. There was no big announcement, no official farewell moment with Hollywood, but step by step, Steven Seagal began to move away from the world that had once shaped his name, not because he had completely lost the ability to exist in it, but because the connection between him and that industry was no longer as before. Opportunities no longer came in the old way, doors no longer opened with the same readiness. And when a place no longer welcomes you in the way you were once used to, staying becomes harder than leaving. This departure did not happen toward a single destination. It was a process of shifting from one place to another, from a familiar environment to spaces where he was less observed. His life began to stretch across many countries, places where his presence did not carry the same weight as in Hollywood. There, he did not have to face the same level of attention, the same repeated questions, the same prejudices that had formed over time. And in that change, perhaps for the first time in many years, he found a different kind of quiet. A kind of quiet that did not come from control, but from no longer being at the center of attention. During this period, the relationship between him and Vladimir Putin became a point that the public could not overlook, not because it was completely unexpected, but because it highlighted the increasingly large difference between the path he chose and what the West expected from him. This attachment, in the eyes of many, was not just a personal relationship. It became a symbol, a sign, that he had truly stepped out of the orbit he once belonged to. Choices like that could not avoid controversy. In an increasingly polarized world, where every action is placed in a larger political and social context, standing on one side, or even simply appearing next to a specific figure, also carries meaning that goes beyond the personal. For Steven, that was not new. He had become used to being perceived through many different lenses. But this time, the difference became clearer. It was no longer a debate within the entertainment industry, but a change in the way he was perceived at a broader level. Hollywood, meanwhile, continued to move without him. New faces appeared, new stories were told, and the industry that he had once been an important part of gradually became something unfamiliar. Not because he no longer remembered how it worked, but because he was no longer a part of it in the way he once was. Broken professional relationships were not easily reconnected. Connections that once existed were no longer strong enough to pull him back. And over time, that distance was not only geographical, it became a distance of identity. The new life he built was not like what he once had. It did not revolve around shooting schedules, around meetings with producers, around maintaining an image in front of the public. It was slower, less visible, and in a way, less directly judged, but that did not mean it carried no consequences. When a person moves away from the environment that shaped them for a long time, they do not just leave a place. They leave a part of themselves. There were moments, perhaps not shared, not spoken, when he looked back at the path he had traveled, not with clear regret, but with an awareness that that path had taken him to a place he could not return to in the old way. Not because he did not want to, but because what had happened could not be simply reversed by a decision. And in that departure, one thing became clearer than ever. Sometimes, being pushed out of a world is not only the end of a chapter, it is the beginning of a life you never thought you would live. A life no longer defined by what you once achieved, but by the way you exist when all of that is no longer by your side. Steven did not completely disappear. He simply chose a different path, a different space, a different way of existing. But in the eyes of many, that change was not easily understood, because they still looked at him through the lens of the past, of what he once was, of the place he once belonged to. And when a person changes while the world does not change the way it looks at him, the distance between them and that world can only grow larger. That was not an ending in the usual way. There was no clear line between before and after. There was only a shift, slow but decisive, taking him out of the world that had once defined him, to step into a space where he had to redefine himself, not by lights, not by fame, but by what remained, when all of those things were no longer present. After all those shifts, Steven Seagal's life gradually entered a rhythm that he had almost never experienced. Before, a rhythm no longer dominated by lights, by shooting schedules, by expectations from millions of unfamiliar eyes. He appeared less, spoke less, and most importantly, he no longer tried to explain himself to the world in the way others expected. Appearances in the media became rare, not because he completely withdrew, but because he no longer placed himself in a position where he needed to be seen continuously. And in a world where presence is often measured by the level of appearance, that silence was easily misunderstood as disappearing. But reality was not that simple. His life did not stop it, only changed shape. His current family, the relationships he kept and built after all the upheavals, gradually became the new center of his life. No longer an abstract concept as before, no longer a place he tried to cling to and then left, but a space that existed quietly, without show, without needing confirmation from the outside. Ordinary moments, days without a dense schedule, evenings not interrupted by work, gradually became familiar, and in that familiarity, there was a kind of quiet that before he had never really allowed himself to feel. No longer pursuing fame in the old way did not mean he completely abandoned the person he once was. What he had built still existed, but it was no longer the center. He no longer needed to prove anything to the public, no longer needed to maintain an image that had been shaped many years earlier. And when a person no longer lives to maintain an image, they begin to have space to face themselves, not the version seen by others, but the version that exists when no one is watching. The pace of life slowed down in a way that, at first, might have felt strange to him. A person who had been used to high intensity, to constant pressure, to always having to move forward, did not easily adapt to the slowing down. But over time, that slowness was no longer a void that needed to be filled. It became a part of the way he existed. Days passed no longer measured by achievements or recognition, but by smaller things, less noticed things, but perhaps truer things. And in that separation, one thing became clear. Very few people truly understood his current life, not because he deliberately hid it, but because the distance between the image the public was familiar with and the person he was now was too great. What people remembered about him was tied to a specific time, to a specific image. But people do not stop at one moment. They change, adapt, and sometimes become something that even those who once followed them no longer recognize. The quiet that replaced the noise was not an ending. It was a different state, a state with no applause, no constant attention, but also no pressure to maintain things that no longer fit. And in that state, perhaps for the first time in many years, he did not need to fight to hold his position. He did not need to control everything around him. He did not need to prove that he still had value in the eyes of others. But the quiet also brought questions that were not always easy to answer. When, no longer caught in the flow of work and fame, things that had once been pushed aside tended to come back. Past decisions, lost relationships, paths that were chosen, and paths that were not chosen. Not all of them carried regret, but they existed as a part of the story he could not separate from. Perhaps what was hardest to understand for those looking from the outside was not that he moved away from the lights, but that he seemed to accept a life that no longer revolved around recognition. In a world where fame is often seen as the destination, moving away from it could be understood as failure. But there is also another way of looking at it, that it was a choice, a shift from living the way others expected to, existing in a way that he himself could accept. And in that silence, not everything was resolved, not every crack was healed, but there was a change that was not loud, that did not need to be recognized. but was enough to create a different space in his life. A space where he was no longer completely defined by the past, but also not completely separated from it. A space where he existed, not as a symbol, but as a human being, with everything that brought with it. And in that prolonged quiet, when there was no longer the noise of lights or expectations from the outside, Steven Seagal began to face something he had always tried to avoid before his own life. Looking back, not through moments of success, but through what had been left behind. With no longer dense schedules to fill the time, no longer meetings or roles to keep his mind busy, memories began to return in a clearer way. Not all of them were painful, but enough to make him stop longer at things he had always passed by so quickly before. Looking back at the entire journey, not every decision was wrong, but not all of them were right as he once believed. There were choices made at times when he thought he was doing what was necessary to move forward, to keep control, to not get stuck. But, over time, those choices left consequences that could not be fully repaired. Relationships that were no longer there. Opportunities that did not come back. Moments that, if he could live again, he might do differently. But life does not work that way. It does not allow going back. It only allows continuing with what has happened. There is a truth that he gradually realized, not in a single moment, but through many years of accumulation, that not everything can be controlled. This, for a person who had built his entire life on the foundation of control, was not easy to accept. But reality does not change according to what people want. No matter how disciplined or strong you are, there are things that still lie beyond your reach. People who leave, opportunities that disappear, the ways the world chooses to perceive you, all of those things exist without needing your permission. Facing that was not an easy process. It was not like learning a new skill or adapting to a different environment. It required a deeper change, a change in the way he saw himself. No longer the person who always had to control everything. No longer the person who had to maintain a specific image, but a human being who accepted that there would always be parts of his life that were not perfect, and that did not make him weaker. It only made him more real. But that truth came with a different feeling: loneliness. Not the loneliness of having no one around, but the loneliness of understanding that there are things you have to face by yourself. No one can go back for you. No one can repair what has happened. And in those moments, when everything became clearer, he could no longer escape by continuing to move. He had to stay, had to look at what had passed and accept that it was a part of him. This acceptance did not come like a victory. It did not bring a feeling of complete liberation. But it created a change. A small change, but enough to affect the way he existed every day. Instead of fighting against what had happened, he began to learn how to live with it. Instead of trying to control everything, he began to let go of things that were no longer within reach. And in that process, something else gradually appeared. Not perfection, but a form of peace that did not need to be proven. Not everyone noticed this change. From the outside, he could still be seen through the old lens, through what had been said about him in the past. But the most important change did not happen in front of others. It happened inside, where there was no audience, where there was no continuous judgment. And it was right there that, for the first time in many years, he did not need to be some version of himself to meet expectations. He only needed to be himself, with everything that brought with it. He might never say all of these things out loud. There was no interview where he sat down and told everything in a way that others could fully understand. But not every truth needs to be spoken to exist. Some truths only need to be accepted. And for Steven, that might be the most important step, not changing the way the world saw him, but changing the way he saw himself. And in that silence, one thing became clearer than ever. Life is not a continuous chain of victories, nor is it a story that can be controlled from beginning to end. It is a journey where each choice leaves a trace, where each mistake carries a lesson, and where a person, in the end, is not defined by what they have achieved, but by the way they face everything they cannot change. And after all, when the questions had been asked, when the memories had been looked back at in a way he had never allowed himself before, what remained was not a clear conclusion, but a human being with everything that had made him. Steven Seagal had never been a perfect life, not a straight story, not a journey built from choices that were always right. His life was the intersection of strong decisions and unavoidable consequences, of moments reaching the peak and silences that no one wanted to look into for too long. He was not someone widely loved in the way many other stars were. His image, over time, had become more complex, harder to grasp, and in many cases, more controversial. But there is one thing that even his critics would find hard to deny: he could not be forgotten. Not because he was always right, but because he had left a mark deep enough to exist beyond the changes of time. In cinema, especially in the action genre, what he brought was not just roles. He brought a different approach, one where martial arts was not just visuals, but reality. His movements were not created to look good, but to be effective. Fight scenes were not just performances, but carried the feeling that they could happen in real life. And in an industry where the line between real and fake always blurred, that created a difference that was not easily replaced. His influence was not always mentioned directly, but it exists in the way action movies developed afterward, in the way actors approach martial arts, in the way audiences perceive authenticity on screen. He was not the only one who contributed to that change, but he was a part of it, a part that cannot be separated when looking back at the history of the genre. But his legacy was not built only from what he achieved. It was also shaped by the conflicts he went through, by the controversies he could not avoid, by the choices that did not always lead to good results. And it was that mixture that made his story impossible to simplify into a single definition. He was not just a hero, he was also not just a controversial figure. He was a combination of both, a human being carrying contradictions that not everyone is ready to face. He may not have achieved complete reconciliation with the past. He may not have had every crack healed. But that does not take away the value of the fact that he still continues to exist, still continues to move forward, even when the path is no longer as clear as before. Not everyone has the ability to do that. Not everyone can stand firm when their image is changed in the public eye, when what once defined them is no longer there. The final image of him is not a resounding victory, nor is it a complete failure. It is the image of a man who has been through it all: success, loss, controversy, loneliness, and is still there, not as an unbeatable symbol, but as proof that a human being can continue, even when they are no longer the version the world once knew. And perhaps that is exactly what many people had suspected for a very long time, but had never truly seen clearly: that behind everything said about Steven Seagal, there is not just a story, but a human being, complex, imperfect, but strong enough to go through his entire journey without stopping halfway. The story of Steven Seagal is not a journey that makes people easily admire in the traditional way, but a journey that makes people stop and think. The most painful thing is not the controversies or the decline in fame, but the way a child who grew up lacking emotional connection gradually became a man who did not know how to hold on to the most important things in his life. When looking back at the years he left America for Japan to find himself but fell into a deeper form of isolation, or the way he left his first family without being able to explain it fully, we clearly see a repeating pattern, always moving forward but never truly healing the past. Success in Hollywood with Under Siege or the iconic roles brought him to the peak. But right there, the control and ego formed from childhood began to break relationships, leading to him gradually becoming isolated and losing his position. The accusations and the media turning away not only collapsed his public image, but also pushed him farther from the place that had once been the center of his life. However, what is worthy of respect is that he still continues to exist, still finds ways to adapt, still learns to accept that not everything can be controlled. For the American people, this story is a strong reminder that material success or fame cannot replace emotional growth. A society that values individualism and strength, like America, very easily overlooks the importance of learning how to connect, listen, and maintain relationships. Steven Seagal's life shows that if you do not face early wounds, they will quietly shape every choice afterward. And sometimes the most courageous thing is not conquering the world, but learning how not to run away from yourself. If the story of an imperfect man who still continues to stand firm like Steven Seagal makes you think, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a sign of respect for that contradictory journey. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next video where we will continue to explore lives that the world thinks it has understood, but in reality never has.